Stand clear of the closing doors, please.
Welcome aboard, everyone. Welcome to our next episode of Democracy Exchange with the DePo, the one-stop station where we engage in conversations to foster understanding. I'm your host, Samantha Conrad. Today, we have a special guest, Dr. Miller. She is an expert on American politics and elections, and importantly for today's episode, women in the American political field. Dr. Miller, thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, for those of you who don't know to start off, Dr. Miller has made a documentary called Trailblazing Women in Ohio Politics, and as the name implies, this documentary is about some of the first women in the field of politics in Ohio and the important legacy that they have left in the political field. And to start off our conversation today, I'm going to ask you, what made you want to make a documentary on female political leaders, or trailblazers as you call them?
It kind of landed in my lap, if you will. So I hadn't spent years dreaming of making a documentary, but I had spent years researching women in American politics, and in particular, the challenges that women have faced historically and in contemporary times with getting elected to public office. We actually had an alum of the university, Mary Beth Ray, and she approached our former president and the provost, who was Rodney Rogers at the time, he was the provost, and drew to their attention the fact that there were some women who'd secured these unbelievably high offices in Ohio, but hadn't really ever been recognized. So think the first woman attorney general of Ohio, the first woman speaker of the House. And in, an alumni, it may have been, I've always pictured it as probably like a cocktail party. I'm not really sure how this was suggested to the president and Provost Rogers at the time, but it was maybe BGSU would like to do something to sort of mark and honor the accomplishments of women like this. So I got a call from Provost Rodney Rogers. And first of all, when you get a call from the provost and you're a faculty member, and for me, it started with an email. Melissa, give me a call as soon as you can. That's a little scary, okay? That's a little scary. But then he said, he told me about how the president's office, and he'd been brought in, was talking to this alum about maybe doing a project, and he said, we thought of you because you are sort of our on-campus expert on women and politics, and come up with an idea, see what you can come up with. And so I started thinking about it. I'm like, I've read all this incredibly fascinating research about how women are covered by the media when they run for office, how women are less likely to be recruited by political gatekeepers to run for office, experiences of sexism and discrimination when they do run and when they do take office and this kind of thing. I'd read that sort of research that was based on surveys of women who'd run and women who'd served in elective office. So I sort of knew what that research said, but I found it so fascinating, and I thought, I want to bring this to life. I think these women will have fascinating stories. And I thought, why not a documentary? I had already worked with WBGU PBS in terms of appearing on the Journal, their flagship public affairs program. I reached out. I said, would you be interested? They said, sounds great. And that's how it was born. That's how the documentary came to be. And I'm so glad, because the women's stories truly did turn out to be absolutely fascinating.
That's awesome. And as a woman, I have obviously experience, I loved your Women in American Politics class. I think everybody should take it. And in that class, we actually talked about this, but I want you to answer, do you think having female political leaders are important for young women? And if so, why do you think so?
I do think it's important, and thank you for your plug for my class. I love teaching it.
It's awesome. Everyone should take it.
It's going to be offered not this spring, but it's offered every other spring, so spring 2026. And there are a couple considerations here. One is, I do think it is important to have role models for women in all kinds of different industries and professions. And the thing is that politics, when we think of, for instance, the STEM sciences, how important it is. There have been so many studies done on how important it is to have women as role models in the sciences, as women who can mentor, as women who can be that symbol for young girls who are, going to career day at their middle school and trying to think what career might I want to do, and so that women could maybe picture themselves as an astronaut, or these professions that little girls when I grew up never dreamed of that as a possibility. Politics is really no different. Women are underrepresented at all levels of government. And when we think women are just over 50% of the population, but only about a quarter of members of Congress, which, by the way, is a huge advance. It's been very slow and incremental. But my goodness, it was women like those that I interviewed on camera for Trailblazing Women in Ohio Politics that started running for office in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. They're the trailblazers who, back when there were just a handful of women in the U.S. House of Representatives, started to run and started to climb the ranks. So I think it's important for the legitimacy of institutions, and that's another piece of it, that those institutions do reflect, basically, is perfect, demographic reflection of Congress, of exactly the demographic composition of the U.S. even possible. That's hard to represent every single, right? We're a very diverse society and everything. But in terms of the representation of women, getting closer to that 50-50 is an important goal, and maybe someday it will be parity.
I think that's a great point. And we're going to talk a little bit about why there might be less women in the political space, as there probably should be, considering we're talking population here. And one of the reasons for that, I'm curious, do you think, compared to men, how are female political leaders treated by the media, and how might that have an impact on their ability to hold office positions?
So I'll start by saying how women have been traditionally treated in the media. So thinking about BGSU alum Betty Montgomery, who became the first woman Attorney General of Ohio, or Joanne Davidson, who became the first woman Speaker of the House, or Ryan McClin, the first woman mayor of Dayton and the first African-American woman in the Ohio Senate. In the 70s, in the 80s, into the 90s, and even some research in the early 2000s showed that women got considerably less media coverage than their male counterpart. So if they were running for Congress, that woman running for Congress got less attention of any kind from the media than the man who was also running for that same seat. Then the coverage that women did get during the 70s, during the 80s, as I said, into the 90s, and even some of that data from the early 2000s said, when women were lucky enough to get coverage, it wasn't the same substantively as the kind of coverage that men got. And their coverage tended to mention things that would never have been pointed out about a male candidate. For instance, a mother of three, and the candidate was wearing high heels and a light powder blue suit, right? When coverage of a male candidate would never have said a father of three wearing a dark blue suit with a green tie, right? So the kinds of coverage women was getting wasn't much compared to what men was getting. And then it was about things that weren't about policy, weren't about the candidate's platform and so forth. Now, we have now seen in mainstream news coverage that there's much more equity and fairness. And I think there's training in schools of journalism. There's training in journalism departments here at BGSU, right? That journalists are now trained to not, to be careful about what they say about the physical appearance of any candidate, right? Because of this kind of work that's been done. And so we see less of it now. But that's mainstream media. We have a whole like internet media, right? All kinds of new forms of media. Those studies haven't been done yet. And my suspicion is there are lots of non-mainstream news outlets where those kinds of we'd call them old-fashioned biases are still very prominent today. That kind of research still needs to be done.
That actually leads beautifully into my next question, so thank you for that. I was actually going to ask you, I know the research hasn't really been done yet, but do you think personally that social media has had an impact on the way that female political leaders are perceived?
I do think social media has had an impact on politics, just hands down.
Absolutely.
I mean, my goodness, what a change. The use of social media. For instance, when Donald Trump was first elected president, or I should say first ran for president in 2016, and then became president, some scholars were calling it the Twitter presidency, because Twitter hadn't been around prior to that. And I'll have to be careful. Some listeners will know exactly when Twitter was established. But the point was that, like other presidents before him, think Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who used the latest whiz-bang technology, the radio, right, to talk directly to voters. Donald Trump was using Twitter. Now, this campaign cycle, we're seeing a whole Instagram and TikTok and all kinds of social media being used. I think there needs to be research done on that, and it's beginning to be possible thanks to the technology to sort of like scrape, and sometimes these are available, right? Scrape the social media posts and then do, an interesting study that's like, number one, how do women candidates versus men candidates self-present on what they post? All right, what is their emphasis? And then you can do things like then analyze what comments they get and what kind of feedback they get. I think that research is just emerging, to be honest with you. And I think there could be some real differences in terms of like the presentation of women who are Republicans running for office versus women who are Democrats. Why do I say that? Just because anecdotally, and part of this is just, the changing nature of the Republican Party, but conservative women running for office, we've seen some high-profile examples of women, for instance, running as Republicans for congressional races and that sort of thing, holding firearms, right? We never would have seen that as from a Republican woman running in the 70s, 80s. So things are changing. And I think it'd be a fascinating question. Are they more likely than Republican men to hold firearms? Maybe it's a Republican Party thing, right? Because gun rights has become so central to the Republican Party platform. I'd love to see that study. And it could be done. You can imagine. It's just looking at all the posts and seeing what's their self-presentation. Now, the technology is there to do sort of straightforward, like either somebody's holding a firearm or they're not in the post, right? In the picture, or in the TikTok video. So you have to think of like another good example. This could be done across political parties. Are women or men more likely to post pictures or short videos of themselves with kids? And it used to be in the 80s, women who ran for office were told, oh my gosh, don't surround yourself with kids and the campaign flyers and all that, because you're trying to beat the stereotype that your place is in the home, right? A very, I suspect, somewhat old-fashioned notion, right? That would be another way you could look at how have things changed. And so I think social media allows us to see both sort of self-presentation and reaction from voters. And that makes it different than, say, looking at nightly news broadcasts and how candidates are featured, or newspaper articles and how candidates are talked about. Now you get to see how do the candidates themselves present, and how are they reacted to by voters? And it's just a wonderful opportunity for some really cool research.
I think that is going to be, because I agree with you. I think that social media has made a huge impact on elections, and I think that research will be fascinating to see the results of, because it's become huge. Like, it's become standard at this point. And going back to actually Twitter and Donald Trump's 2016 campaign, how do you think, both by the social media and media, how do you think that the way that Hillary Clinton was treated by social media, just the media, news, what have you, how do you think that impacted the results of the 2016 presidential election?
So I haven't conducted the social media piece, so I can't, you know what I'm saying? I think that research, and honestly, that's the kind of research where it's just all about getting access to the tweets or getting access to all of those Facebook posts. Or I'm trying to think in 2016, right?
Yeah.
TikTok wasn't on the radar.
No, probably
right?
not. Yeah.
So you'd have to do that. I think one thing that I really noticed was, if we look at how Hillary Clinton was treated by the media in 2016 versus how she was treated by the media in 2008, which I know may seem like ancient history to some listeners. However, she ran in the Democratic primary against Barack Obama and lost that primary. Of course, he got the nomination, was elected president, and then reelected in 2012. Well, when she ran in 2008, and I did a study with a former colleague, Dr. Jeff Peake of the Political Science Department, who's now the chair of the Political Science Department at Clemson. He and I, together with a huge team of students, we looked at mainstream media in terms of newspaper coverage of all the candidates who ran for president on both sides of the aisle in 2008 in the primaries. And we ended up doing, I think, what was a fascinating study of Clinton's coverage versus Barack Obama's. And she didn't suffer in terms of the amount of coverage, but hers was far more negative. Far more negative. And it had some of those aspects to it, like the mention that she was, that she was the wife of Bill Clinton and former First Lady. That was mentioned a ton. And additionally, that if she were to be elected, it would be historic. If she got the nomination, it would be historic. Okay. One little observation about that is scholars have suggested that when the media covers, oh, this would be a breakthrough if this woman was elected, say, president, or got the nomination or whatever, that may be factually correct. And we know it would be, right? There's never been a woman president. We've never elected a woman president. And so it would be historic. But when journalists point that out to readers, to viewers, maybe even subconsciously, it's like, oh yeah, maybe America's not ready. Or just triggering people to picture what a president looks like. And the only model we have for what a president looks like is a male model, right? So many challenges there. What we found in 2016, the coverage was, and this is more not my own research, but what I've seen for mainstream media coverage, is that there weren't those kinds of inequalities, except that in those last days when the FBI Director Comey finally came out and gave the press conference about her emails and all of that, that in those last days, that became the narrative heading into Election Day. So again, I think that still could systematically be covered and researched. So, by the way, could Kamala Harris's coverage during this most recent election. And the kind of work we do in political science is that not just the anecdotal. We go beyond that. Student projects in our classes can go beyond that and find ways to look, maybe not on a massive scale for a seminar paper, but on a small scale. There's just fascinating research to be done. What I'll tell you is things have improved in the mainstream media for women. And there's research to demonstrate that. Does it mean there are no challenges? There are still challenges, particularly in the social media world, in the internet media world. But the days when a woman's pantsuit becomes part of the story, I think those are behind us. And I think that's a good thing. Americans just want to evaluate the candidates, right? And that's what voters say. I just want to evaluate the candidates and their policies. And so I've been pleased to see that the media coverage of women has improved in the time that I've been studying it.
Now, why do you think, again, on the topic of female political leaders in national elections, why do you think that in the United States, women political leaders have been less successful getting elected to national office as opposed to like state or local office?
It's totally true. And first of all, let me just flesh out, Sam, exactly what you've talked about is that if you look at what percentage of women hold local office, it's a bigger percentage in the local village, town council, city council kind of thing. Then you go up to the state legislature, the percentage of women shrinks. Then you go up to the congressional level, the percentage of women shrinks. Then you go up to the president, and there's never been a woman president. So that kind of pyramid shape is what we've seen manifest throughout the country for decades, that there are fewer women at the top and women tend to be elected at the local level. There's so many factors that go into it, so I'll just touch on a couple. One is women do tend to run more frequently for local level office, and there are a lot of reasons for that. So part of it is that women, despite advances in this area, so now thinking sort of like sociologically about it, women continue to be more likely to be responsible for household duties, care of the home, care of the children. And again, there's been some move toward equalization in individual households on that. But even with the trends, like I have a slide that I love to show. And occasionally I'm asked to give presentations about these kinds of topics, right, publicly. And one of them is this awesome slide that shows the percentage of men who say that they're responsible for some household chores each week. And if you look at it, and it's from like the 1960s and it goes through the 2000s, and that line just goes up, right? So we've seen those kinds of demographic changes, yet it remains the case that women tend, if they run, to run at the local level, and they're less ambitious now to run for higher level office. So is that because they have a higher burden of household and family duties than men do? Or is it a socialization kind of thing where it starts at a very young age? And is there something subconsciously going on in classrooms, around family dinner tables and so forth, where little boys are more encouraged to, you could be president someday, right? Is that something that little girls hear? And so there's such a multiplicity of factors that come into play. But the reality is that when you think about who runs for president, now, Donald Trump is an exception in that he had never run for or held lower level elective office before he won in 2016. So he's a big exception, but let's put him aside for a minute as a very unique politician. Most people who run for president, all the presidents who've served, we think maybe Eisenhower, right? He had military experience and not elected political office. But all the other presidents, Washington had Revolutionary War general experience, right? But all the others, we think of them, they were in Congress, they were a governor of a state, maybe they were a U.S. senator. They had done something. And because men continue to be predominantly have about 75% of the seats in Congress, for instance, there just aren't as many women to be in that pipeline then, to have the kind of resume that they could run for president or that they'd even think about running for president. So there are sort of pipeline issues involved. There are questions about the socialization of young girls and young women. And also the ambition of women for higher office. There's a lot of work out there that studies and looks systematically in political science at these factors and find that these are the sort of disadvantages that lead to a situation where it's still, uncommon for a woman to even run for president. We've had a few in the last election cycles here and there. But the last thing I'll say is also that other countries in the world that are ahead of us, they've elected a woman prime minister or a woman president. Those countries, in some cases, have fewer pipeline issues because they have quotas for women in their national legislatures or for the political parties that are competing for seats in those national legislatures. Literally, the quota is set, 50% of the candidates on the party's slate of candidates have to be women. Now, whether they get elected or not, we'll see. But those countries that are way ahead of us, a lot of them either have quotas for the representation of women or they have prime ministerial positions where it's the party that elects the leaders. So think British politics, that parliamentary system, and we think Margaret Thatcher. Some listeners may be, history buffs out there. She was the first woman prime minister of England. Well, she didn't have to win a nationwide election where voters selected her. She was selected by the Conservative Party as the leader of the party. So those are so many reasons why we haven't seen women succeed in great number at the national level and yet to see a woman president. And you'll notice none of the answers I just gave you are unique to Vice President Kamala Harris and her experience, right? So yes, there are factors about the most recent campaign that we could talk about, but there's so many kind of baked in factors that make it difficult for a woman to even run, the probability that we'd have a lot of women running for president, and then also win.
Now, speaking of Kamala Harris, to what extent do you think intersectionality affects female political leaders, and do you think that that's an important field of political research?
It's definitely an important aspect of political research because women are not a monolith. Women are not all like-minded. And we can even see that in the 2024 election results in the sense that, yes, there was a gender gap with women somewhat more likely to vote for Kamala Harris, although men were even more likely to vote for Donald Trump. So that gender balance that tipped toward Kamala Harris among women tipped the other way in a larger magnitude toward Donald Trump. But even if you look at women, there were, Donald Trump did very well among women. And so women are not all like-minded about this. Now, so first of all, intersectionality in terms of a theory that we bring to the study of, women in politics is the notion that let's take just a woman's experience on the campaign trail. And historically, as I did in the documentary, and also in sort of other research that's done that uses survey data, and there are all kinds of ways you can study women running for office. It does make a difference whether the woman running is a white woman or is a woman of color or is a working class woman versus a middle or upper middle class woman. These are the kinds of dimensions that the theory of intersectionality suggests ought to be considered rather than just generalizing about women running for office. Women are all different. Their experiences are unique and different. Women are all over the political spectrum, and they come from all walks of life. And so I think it is important, and I think the research that will be done going forward about Kamala Harris's experience running for president, and particularly get back to the media coverage, I would go back to the comment I made earlier about how traditionally in the 70s and 80s, if women could get coverage, it might be, well, if elected, Melissa Miller would be the first member of the city council, right? And kind of cueing voters, right, to think, oh, she's different than anyone we've ever had, right? Scholars might call this othering a candidate, right? And so I would be interested in looking at mainstream and social media mention of the fact that Kamala Harris's, had she been elected president, would have been historic on a couple different levels, right? First woman, she would have been first woman elected president, first African-American woman as president, first Asian American, right? Like, so all those dimensions, did that get mentioned so much that it othered her in a way? I think that's worthy of study.
I completely agree. And to follow up kind of on that point, do you think, or how do you think that kind of this concept of intersectionality, how do you think that that played a role in kind of both her campaign and the outcome of the 2024 election?
One thing that struck me about Kamala Harris's campaign is that she really didn't talk about her gender, her race, her ethnicity. And we can think of a couple of high-profile examples of that where she just kind of said, you know, not relevant, move forward. So there was an interview, I think it was a sit-down interview that she did, I believe it was with CNN. And it was after she was named, and some weeks went by, and she was getting a lot of pressure to sit down and do a major network interview, a major TV interview, so Americans could get to know her. And Donald Trump had made a claim on the campaign trail in an interview that he did that said, well, I didn't know she was black, and kind of questioned her race. And I won't go into that. It's available. There was more to it than that. But of course that came up in the CNN interview. And that really was inviting Kamala Harris to respond and say something about her race and ethnicity. And she said, and if I'm remembering correctly, she said, same old tired playbook, next question. That literally, and I might not have the quote exactly right, but was kind of like, not relevant. Yeah, let's move on. So she really downplayed it. That was very different, by the way, than Hillary Clinton when she ran and became the Democratic nominee in 2016. She really emphasized her gender. She emphasized the historic nature of the campaign. She wore the white pantsuit in tribute to the suffragettes when she gave her acceptance of the nomination speech at the Democratic National Convention. There was so much visual imagery at that convention and so much talk about what a breakthrough it would be for women. Hillary Clinton, by the way, was that a great idea? Like, which is the better path? Who knows, right? Difficult to tell. For Hillary Clinton, she really, in 2008, did kind of a Kamala Harris thing. I'm not going to talk about my gender. My gender's not relevant. She would also kind of shut down those questions and just run like anyone else running for president. And she lost the nomination to Barack Obama. 4 years later, she runs. She really emphasizes the historic nature of her bid for president. She becomes the Democratic nominee, and then she wins the popular vote. Now, 8 years later, Kamala Harris, really wants to not really talk about those things. Now, there were some it wasn't a total, the night before the election, she was at Howard University, where she's an alum, historically black college. She's an alum of that university. So So, there were some things that she did, but not really playing up race and gender at all. And she didn't win. But of course, there are so many factors that went into that loss, right? So I think in the weeks and months and days to come, scholars will be, and the public too, trying to unpack to what extent did this factor, make a difference, and to what extent did the other. I will say briefly just that political science research for decades has well documented that people tend to vote based on their pocketbook, meaning they tend to vote based on how they are feeling financially and economically. And so, setting aside Kamala Harris as the Democratic nominee for a minute, setting aside her race and her gender, no matter who the Democratic nominee was, whether it was Joe Biden himself, whether it was Kamala Harris, or had things played out differently, maybe it could have been a Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, or Gavin Newsom, the governor of California. Any Democrat was going to have a really, really tough time winning in 2024 because so many Americans, and it's documented in poll after poll, including the BGSU poll that we ran out of the DePo in September and October, suggested that Americans felt the country was on the wrong track, a majority, and they didn't feel that the economy was, that they felt they were worse off and the economy wasn't working for them.
And this actually plays, I'm sure, a huge part into my next question is why do you think that Kamala Harris lost the 2024 election? Which you did kind of just answer, but I'm sure there's more to it than that.
There's definitely more to it than that, but I would say that is a huge piece, was that going into this election, the Biden administration was not seen as a success in terms of the economy, despite the fact that, they had some statistics to suggest that on certain economic indicators, the economy was better than it had been 4 years ago. But honestly, all the data slides in the world are not going to make a difference to the voter who's having trouble putting food on the table or having trouble paying their bills. So I think that was a big factor. I also think that this was a one-of-a-kind election in that we had a former president running who served 4 years ago. So you had a former president running against the current vice president. So which was the incumbent? Well, I think we know the answer. I do think that voters treated Kamala Harris as the incumbent. She's the vice president in the Biden administration. But it was odd in that way. And then another way it was odd was that she only had, I believe it was about 107 days to run a campaign. And in some ways, that was kind of refreshing. Refreshing in the sense that there are other countries that have much shorter campaign seasons, and given the extent of all the advertising and the direct mail and people, just scanning their phone, oh my gosh, everything's about politics and my feed is full of ads for candidates. People get kind of tired of it. So it's short, and some voters that was good at folks were ready when this election finally came. But at the same time, it's hard enough to win a presidential election when you've started running 2 years prior. And Vice President Harris had just 107, 108 days. Then layer that with, the possibility that subconsciously people, and the Trump campaign did, they, of course, Kamala Harris didn't run in a vacuum. She ran against a candidate who was negatively messaging about her, as her campaign was negatively messaging about Donald Trump. So all of these factors together. Do I think, for instance, should she have picked Josh Shapiro instead of Tim Walz as her presidential nominee? I think given the size of the loss, I really don't think that vice presidential choice was going to make, it really, with the size of the victory, It wasn't as close. It wasn't that close in the end. I think it's no doubt a combination of all these kinds of factors with the state of the economy and feelings about the current presidency and President Biden were the big one.
Yeah, I agree. I think she also had the disadvantage of being attached to Biden as well, which, in my opinion, obviously hindsight's always 2020, kind of doomed her from the start.
That's right, because she was running as the vice president of an unpopular president.
Yes.
And so, if you look at the popularity of incumbent presidents at, September 1 in a presidential election year, where that popularity of the incumbent president stands is a huge predictive factor in who's going to win in November. Is it going to be the presidential candidate of the incumbent's party? Well, then it generally is, if that current incumbent is enjoying widespread popularity. Certainly well over 50%. That would be a totally different electoral context. And we've got lots of data over many presidential election cycles to demonstrate how important the popularity of the president is, because presidential elections are generally a referendum on the incumbent, whether that incumbent is running or not. How do people feel about that incumbent? And in 2024, voters weren't feeling the love, right, for the Biden administration. And so that made for an enormous uphill battle for Kamala Harris in a very short time frame.
I agree. For our final question today, to round it out, I'm going to ask you the somewhat loaded question of, why do you think that we haven't had a woman president yet?
I think structurally we don't have and will never have some of the features of countries that are far out ahead of us. I looked recently, and I think it was either 2022 or 2023, the World Bank puts out a report, and I believe it's every year or every 2 years. And I looked at the most recent report, and the U.S. is 63rd in terms of countries in the world, in terms of women's political empowerment. And how do they measure that? By how many elected offices women hold in the country. The U.S. is 63rd. And it goes back to what we were talking about earlier in our discussion about, there are these countries that actually have quotas, and the United States will never have such quotas. It will not happen, because it would have to take either the parties voluntarily instituting quotas, which even that doesn't really work the way our parties work. They don't have that kind of control over who even runs, right? If Sam, you decided to run as a candidate of the Libertarian Party or the Green Party or the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, you would just run. They wouldn't have any say over whether they wanted you to run or not, right? So the parties are not going to do it voluntarily. The Constitution is not going to change, and suddenly that would be, it's just a non-starter. It will never happen to change our Constitution. The bar is so high to amend the Constitution to do something like that. And the other big factor that other countries have that we don't is a parliamentary system. Our founders set up a non-parliamentary system. So we don't elect the president out of Congress. The president isn't. If we were in a prime ministerial system, then our national legislature, those representatives that we send to the national legislature, they'd pick the president. We don't do it that way, and it would take a constitutional change to ever have that happen in the United States. It's just not going to happen. Does it mean we'll never have a woman president? I don't think so. We've now twice had major parties, meaning the Democratic or Republican parties, have nominated a woman. Twice those women have lost, but in 2016, a woman, Hillary Clinton, won the popular vote. Kamala Harris tried to do it in 107 days, which, no matter had it been, a Josh Shapiro or a Gavin Newsom, I think the outcome would have been the same. You know, maybe the number's a little bit different, but I fully expect the outcome would have been the same.
I would be very interested to see what a woman candidate running against someone who is not Donald Trump would look like, because we've only had that so far, and he's just such an exception in every sense of the word that I would be interested to see what that would look like.
I completely agree with you, and I think the Democratic Party will do a lot of soul searching in the days, weeks, months, and years to come about how can we build a winning coalition going forward to win back the White House. And one of the things that concerns me is that the Democrats have nominated in the past 3 elections 2 women and 1 man, Joe Biden. And in those 3 presidential elections, only Joe Biden won. Is it about, oh, that was a huge mistake to have a woman at the top of the ticket? Personally, I don't think so. And I do get concerned that both parties will shy away, that women can't win because of a couple of high-profile examples where women didn't win. But there's more than one reason anyone loses an election. And again, I point to the winning of the popular vote by Hillary Clinton in 2016. That winning of the popular vote by a woman in 2016 does not suggest to me that, oh boy, Americans they can't elect a woman president. They don't see it. They're not ready for it. I don't think that's the case. I don't think that's the case, even after the results of the 2024 election. And what I'd like to personally see is both parties continue to promote women and recruit women to run at lower levels of office, to encourage them to run for higher levels of office at the state legislature and state level, then for federal office, and have more women run like Nikki Haley and Carly Fiorina on the Republican side, like Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren and Hillary Clinton have run on the Democratic side. So it just becomes normal. I think there's been a lot of normalization of women on the ballot at the presidential level in recent years. And so I hope that Kamala Harris's victory is not taken by either party as somehow evidence that a woman can't win. And I think your point about Donald Trump being a really unique candidate to run against, the only person who's beaten him is Joe Biden, and that was in the throes of COVID. That was a very unique election. So I would caution listeners not to draw grand conclusions about the future of women in politics based on the outcome of the 2024 presidential election.
Dr. Miller, thank you so much for being here.
You're so welcome, Sam. This has been a pleasure.
Thank you. Well, here's our last stop today at the Democracy Exchange with the DePo. And I want to once again thank our guest for being here, Dr. Miller. Thank you so much. And thanks to the DePo social media and podcast team, Margaret Kolonsky, Samantha Perry, and Maria Lettieri. And special thanks to Falcon Radio and Professor Alexander, our founder. I've been your host and researcher, Sam Conrad. Join us next time at Democracy Exchange with the DePo. To find the video version of this podcast, you can find us on our YouTube page at BGSU DePo and for the rest of our socials. Bye for now.